audience has been really patient and nice with us. So I think now is finally the time to start taking questions. I wonder if Molly will help us out with the microphones, and yeah, it's all up to you to come up with further questions to take the discussion beyond the present topics. And please introduce yourself briefly if you could.
Yeah, no problem. My name is Barama Asari. I'm a second-year product design student. And it was really interesting the way you were talking about regenerative design, because as a designer, we really focus on, okay, we should be sustainable, but how do we do it? We're going to replace plastic with wood. And wood's good because it doesn't damage the environment. Good, that's where the conversation ends. I think really the way to change it is going down to the way we live, because right now we're shifting from petrol cars to electric cars, but they're still cars. It's not really changing the whole flow, it's just switching it out. But I think it comes down to people willing to sacrifice. Like, are you willing to go to the store and not have any bag and just hold it? Because, well, we have the biodegradable bags, but you need a certain process to degrade it. If we just reduce what we're using, we could really solve a lot more problems than just swapping things out and then living the same lifestyle and then generate new problems.
Thank you so much. That's a great comment.
Can I jump on this one?
I agree. You can, definitely, yes.
Thank you. I think that's such a fantastic point, and I just wanted to respond to it because that's what I was trying to say earlier with this idea of how we, especially as designers and innovators and creatives, this is such a huge opportunity for us to actually imagine those alternative ways of doing things, ways of living. It always makes me think of that absolutely classic Henry Ford quote that's been used to death, but I think it really applies here. You know, he always said that if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have wanted a faster horse. And I think this is, again, that example of, and there's been some brilliant examples from the panel around how there are lots of products out there that are sort of encouraging us to switch, and in some cases maybe that can be useful, but it's just not enough. We're living in a time where it's just not enough. And again, I would like to put it out to everyone here today, and I know there are a lot of students in the audience as well. This is the really exciting bit. This is where we can have such a disproportionate effect of not just imagining a faster horse, but what would be that genuinely radical, transformative solution for the future that is possibly scalable in a way that's very thought through, but really looking at it from a systemic perspective. You know, I think what Delphina, what you've been saying around some of the sort of wider impact and implications of switching, for example, to soy, which in some ways can be equally, if not more, detrimental to certain local ecologies. We really need to think about things from a much, much wider systemic perspective and really understand what the long-term implications and impacts of our proposed solutions are. At the moment, we're sort of plastering things with very quick fixes, but again, that's not really enough. So let's seize these opportunities and actually address them with genuinely regenerative and transformative solutions. That's where we can have an impact, I feel.
Thank you, Enikukka, and thanks very much for the question. Let's take the next one. Yes.
Hear me now? Yeah. So I'm Matthew Freeman. I am president of the British Institute of Interior Design. So thank you very much for all you've said today. It's been really interesting. What I wanted to say was to do with Samantha's point about localization and sort of tying in with the scaling up idea. Do vertical farms help with any of this sort of generating of materials that you can use? Because I've been looking into it, and if you had them in schools, things like that, you can grow exactly the products that you need for the schools. And if you have them on farms, you can grow the same for the cattle. Restaurants can grow what food they need for their restaurants. But does vertical farming help with, like you're talking about your algae and the mushrooms, and does that grow that, and could that grow that at the volume that you need? Because you could put those in everybody's garden and scale it up from there.
Yeah, no, I think vertical farms are fantastic. There's a fun fact: almost all the tomatoes that come to Europe, that are eaten in Europe, come from the Netherlands. tiny, tiny country. And when you go there, it's not all tomato farms, but they make really good use and efficient use of their space. So, yeah, absolutely. I think vertical farming, use of vertical space, is a really efficient use of space. Might not necessarily tackle the issues of diversifying when we're talking about farming, because then it's difficult to grow diverse crops, because if you're designing a vertical farm, you're probably being very particular and specific about what you are designing it around, so say tomatoes, for example. Very different issues, but yeah, I think vertical farming is definitely the future for growing mass crops and algae in particular. If you've ever seen algal bioreactors, they're just like long green tubes. Some of them are like pools, and they can go as high as you would want them to.
Yeah, I think like the work that I was looking at was kind of localization in a different sense, in that so I was concerned specifically with phosphorus pollution in our fresh waters, and that actually is quite a localized thing depending on what country you're in, the amount of urbanization in the country. And so I was looking at blooms of algae that grow anyway, so you really don't need to help them, they're just growing at a massive rate, and the issue is what do you do with them, because they become this waste stream. So what's interesting there is like if you're trying to create products or something from the algae, it's then totally different. You're not getting it from one source, you're getting it from multiple sources at the same time, and that source might be a different quantity each time. There might even be a different species each time. And is it possible to have a sustainable business that deals with a crop that's not in the same place, not at the same time, not the same amount, not the same species? What can you make from it potentially?
All right, thank you very much for the answers and the question. And yes, there's some couple there in the middle.
Hi. Hello.
Oh, over here.
We've got a question from online. So Nina is asking, how do we design cultural change in a competitive landscape with market-driven decisions?
Who would like to respond to that?
We have the question again, maybe, to remind us.
How do we design cultural change in a competitive landscape with market-driven decisions?
Make it profitable? I don't know.
I mean, I think there are different levels of the problem. I think I am very pleasantly surprised of what I'm seeing coming from the creative industries. I see so many young designers and young people from all around the world really setting amazing precedents, and I think that is actually quite strong in creating like an interesting path. We of course need governments to have good policies, and in terms of regenerative design, I think there should be really good schemes to start promoting this. So we need obviously longer visions, and policies are very important. But I think designers have a really important role in making this exciting, taking this to the communities, and I also think there's like a grassroots also way of going about it. But we should be working on it at various scales, from graphic design to journalism to designers, architects, interior designers. I think we should all keep working on this, and I think eventually it will come up to important decision makers.
I agree with policy as well. Like one area that I think is gaining a lot of traction and is really interesting is the idea of giving personhood to ecosystems, to bits of land, and to other kinds of organisms. In a way, in a sense, like subverting the legal system that's in place, because by giving personhood, we don't have to view the kind of destruction or pollution or whatever we're doing to the organism or the ecosystem by its effect on humans. It can be actually by its effect on the ecosystem itself. So, like a lot of the time, they look at the amount of pollution in a river only in terms of what is the hazardous level to a human. And this is like a reimagining to what's the hazardous level to the river, right? And so just that kind of, I think it has to be like a legal shift, but that kind of a legal shift, I think, is like very transformative and is, I think, regenerative.
Yeah, I would agree. I think particularly in terms of policy as well, kind of always goes back to that same thing of diversity, having a more broad suite of voices being represented, particularly, like you were saying before as well, indigenous voices who might have more experience with particular ecosystems. When it comes to policy and governance, making sure that it is not just a monocrop of people to look after our very diverse ecosystems. It's a diverse ecosystem of people looking after our ecosystems. So I think that's quite an interesting way to tackle the issue.
And many cultural shifts and perspective shifts and legal shifts would be needed, right?
Yeah.
And I guess when a question gets formulated like that, how do you become competitive in the market system? Then there's so many assumptions within that already, right? But as the panelists have said, we need these plural values, alternative ways to value things. And I suppose what is competitive might be very different in 5 or 10 years as well, hopefully. Right?
I have something positive to say in this very depressing context. I think actually, if we do things regeneratively and we really apply ecological principles, the products that you will get will be significantly better. Like food, for example, with a really nice soy, you will get more nutrients. And the same thing with the cotton of that nice shirt that is coming from regenerative farming. It will be better. And maybe the last point that I forgot to mention, I think, is education. If the new generation and all of us are transitioning in understanding ecology is really important and we have to change, maybe, yes, we are new customers that are willing to pay a little bit more, buy a little bit less of other stuff, and really invest in regenerative products.
Thank you for that. Great. I think, do we have time for another 2 or 3 questions? So I'll leave it up to you two.
Can I? Thank you. Hi, thank you so much. That was amazing and inspiring. I'm Nicole. I studied biodesign here at CSM. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to just ask 2. The first one is, so I thought, as Samuel was talking about eutrophication and how we can use those waste streams as a resource, I was thinking about the leather industry and how leather is like a waste stream from the meat industry. And I've been learning about how much more effective it will be if we just left the skins to decompose in nature than working them with chemicals and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I was thinking, is there like an ethical framework around getting waste and making it a resource? Because it can be, for example, eutrophication, it's a product of all the animal industries and all the crop industries, right? All the excess nutrients in the water. So if we rely on making new industries out of these wastes, if we want to erase these bad industries, aren't we making that transition more difficult? One question. And then the second question will be around, maybe for the Becoming Regenerative project. Do you have an ethical framework when you educate your clients around something that you're bringing from an indigenous culture, and how are you kind of giving back to those cultures, or is there any thoughts and ideas around that? Those are the questions.
Yes, please.
So I think, firstly, which is I think an important point for all of this, is that the context is the most important thing. Like, it's so important to learn as much of the context of the issue that you're working with, because, as you said, yes, sometimes phosphorus pollution, for example, is from the meat industry. In the UK, it largely isn't. It's from non-meat-based crops being over-fertilized, and it's also from human waste streams.
With the animal manure a lot as well. So it's still coming from the meat industry.
It's mostly from mined phosphate. Another specific issue. Okay, so an ecologist, like, this is also a kind of classic ecologist thought, which is like, we should stop fertilizing the ground because then, or stop over fertilizing the ground because then that fertilizer doesn't get into the waste stream. It is not to, I am not saying that that's not a good option. There can be a plurality of like ways of dealing with the problem. I think we should be reducing the fertilizer that we use. I also think that we should be totally rethinking our like way of dealing with human waste, which at the moment we have like sewage outflows that are literally just going into fresh water. We need to redistribute that back to farmland and or like kind of clean it in a way in which nutrient pollution doesn't fall into freshwater bodies. But the specific issue with phosphorus pollution is that you have this thing called legacy phosphorus. So even if we literally stopped using any phosphorus in the UK right now, never used it, there's 50 to 100 years of it in our soils, which will keep polluting our waters. So essentially, we need to do something proactively to reduce the effects of the pollution. And many of the effects of eutrophication happen when algae blooms die, not necessarily when they're grown. So there's a potential there to remove the algal blooms before they die. And the issues there is like they die and then they release large amounts of carbon dioxide and they create a hypoxic environment. And so that is the very specific situation in which I'm saying there's a business case to use this waste product. And I know that was like a really long spiel, but I think every kind of regenerative project needs a really long spiel to tell you why in this specific case it makes sense. So there might be some very specific cases where like soya makes sense or like growing mushrooms makes sense, when in other cases they don't. So yeah.
I would agree with that as well, that it's very rarely the actual project or process or material that is the issue, it's the scale and the scale of the problems that we have. So plastic, for example, small amounts would be completely fine and is very necessary in some like medical fields, for instance, but it's the scale that we're using in producing these things at. And that's why we need these projects that are small and that are specific and that are responding to a very particular issue with a very particular solution.
Thanks for the question on our projects on sort of ethical stance. As very briefly put, we're beginning the project by just studying existing startups and design projects. So we will sort of try to analyze how they are approaching, environmental ethics, for instance, or ethics in regeneration. We are working on a regenerative impact strategy, and ethics will be a very important component of that. So would love to keep up the discussion on ethics. Thank you. So we have time for one or two more questions, I think, and you get to. Okay.
Hello.
So Molly will bring you the mic.
Hey everyone, I'm Mani. I am a strategic sustainability designer. How does regenerative translate to business? Because right now it's kind of in the realm of innovation and in the realm of the more creative thinking people, how can you make a business case for that? And how long is that going to take before it can realistically translate to a language that they're going to understand? Also, the paradigms involved, like degrowth and stuff, are really weird to like the mainstream. So how does that translate, and does it translate, and does it even need to translate?
Great question. I'd love to discuss this with you directly later as well, but I want to turn to Samantha to perhaps provide a couple of answers.
Yeah, I think it is a tricky one, for sure. The first thing that came to my mind is that it is fashionable at the moment. That's one way to translate or to convince, I suppose, if that's what your angle is. It is fashionable to be sustainable, to be regenerative, to be green. And in some ways that's bad because that can lead to greenwashing. But it does bring up the question, do the means justify the ends? Does it matter if we get to a regenerative point? Does it matter if the motivation was just to be seen to be fashionable, to be seen to be green? I don't have the answer to that, but that is, I know, a technique that has been used to try and encourage maybe certain bigger companies to be more green and more regenerative and more sustainable.
Great, thank you. I mean, if I was a startup in this field, the simplest thing I would do is I would go through maybe 10 or 20 successful regenerative startups in this space who've received, I don't know, 4 to 5 million pounds in investment. Then I would go and see who are the investors and why are they believing in this? And I would potentially contact those investors, so I would get the startup going. So I think there are ways into this, and my personal message would be that I don't always see why regeneration and business should be in opposition. I think the starting point should be that these are not in opposition, and there is a degree of understanding, as you've said. So I think it's up to us to maybe also strengthen those bridges. But thank you for the really, really important question. I think we have time for one more.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, my name is Yue Long. I'm year 2 biodesign PhD student from UCA. So I got 2 questions. First of all, I need to introduce my topic because it's related to my topic. My topic is about plant blindness, try to build a new multi-relation relationship between the human and natural. I try to use like plant education, community, policy, and creative application to engage my project. During my research process, I found even we want to revalue of the new system, like ecosystem or whatever wish system, we need like my first audience to interesting or recognize the problem is in here, let them interesting. Oh, you should be interested in my new system. And then when my first audience interesting or recognize, oh, the problem is here. So we can do the next step, like revalue or do some other size. So I was curious, how did you guys to, like your first audience recognize the problem is in here, interesting, the new system, you made it? This is the first one question. And the second question is about human-centered design and non-human-centered design. Because in the academic, during our design research thinking, we all try to use non-human non-human-centered design to support our researcher, to support our project. But when we do the practical base, like practical project, we will know non-human-centered design, how hard to push the ecosystem. But when you change to human-centered design, it's more easier. So I was curious, during you practice project, are you still use non-human-centered design, or you change to human-centered design? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll have 2 brief responses, and then we'll have to conclude. Who would like to make a start?
I have a quick point on the second question, which was human-centered design was like originated by Dom Norman. And funnily enough, about 3 or 5 years after he created it, he said that it wasn't actually that good. And he came up with a different thing called activity-centered design. Unfortunately, it didn't quite jump off in the same way. But the main difference being lots of different types of people often do the same activities. And that's the kind of things that we should try and design for, like how do we make the activity itself work well. And I think maybe activity-centered design can apply to non-humans as well. So that's how I try and think sometimes, especially in the algal project I recently just talked about, from not a human-centered perspective, but from an activity-centered perspective.
I think also on the same part of the point, to me, human-centered design is limiting your thinking of the project to one part of it, the human part, correct? Then a way to move away from that is to think of not systems design per se, but designing for the system, which is possibly on the same wavelength to what we were just talking about. So instead of focusing on one small part, looking at the entire system that will be involved. So your product, not just looking at the thing that you are creating or the process that you're creating or the project, but looking way back to where the materials are sourced from, the end-of-life solution, looking at the entire system itself. Which I think is probably one of the core parts of regenerative design in general as well.
Great. I was wondering if any Kukka would have anything to say about the need to get an audience or a group interested in your solution, and how do you accomplish that? I mean, you're certainly quite experienced with getting groups of people think quite differently.
Thank you. Absolutely. And building on what Samuel and Samantha have already said, I think this holistic approach is absolutely vital in really understanding who the key stakeholders are. And by stakeholders, again, I don't mean just the human stakeholders, really understanding what are the networks of so-called influencers or users in our cases, who are the primary, secondary users of, or the audiences that will be impacted by whatever we are creating. So I wholeheartedly agree that we absolutely must look at it from a bigger systemic perspective, but also in my case, I've created my own methodology, the Design for Empathy methodology, where actually first and foremost I start from the perspective of empathy, understanding where the empathy gaps are and where there are opportunities for empathy, where that's absolutely needed. So in terms of thinking about how to involve audiences, how to get them interested, again, there isn't really one approach fits all. I think it's very much about the things that have been already mentioned in the panel around really understanding your context beyond the humans that are involved, understanding the wider ecosystems, understanding who are already working in the space, what they're doing, what their needs are, what their agendas are, what kind of change you're looking to create, and thinking about that change that you want to create, what are the key leverage points within that. So today we've covered everything from cultural transformation, we've talked about policy shifts, we've talked about legislation. There are so many different leverage points that we could be working towards, and thinking about it from the perspective of design. I think we need to become much more contextual and much more specific and focused. Samantha talked about this earlier, really understanding what are the sort of communities or the context where we're building those first case studies to prove the need for something like this, but also to show that shift, to prove the impact that we're trying to demonstrate. So I would really start by building out those networks and ecosystems, building a very in-depth understanding of the context, and then understanding what kind of knowledge, what kind of collaborators we need to bring upon that change to facilitate the project. I think that's, again, one of our superpowers as designers is, we like to see ourselves as sort of jacks of all trade, but really we're also very good at bringing together different people, different skill sets, different knowledge bases, creating these networks of collaborators. So I think that's a key thing to consider as well, is that what other voices do we need? We've talked a lot about diversity today in a human and non-human sense. What are the different voices that are missing, whose voices need to be heard, and how we could build these processes of very much more equitable collaborations, again, across human and non-human collaborators.
Right, thank you so much, Enni Kukka. You've done a fine job summing up the discussion today. Thank you for that.